Hi, I'm Pete and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm, and this is the front bolster off of my Farmall 856, and it contains the power steering piston that turns the shaft when you turn the steering wheel that turns the wheels left or right. I looked around YouTube, I haven't seen a video of anybody rebuilding one of these, so that's what I'm going to do in this video. First, a little orientation. I've got this thing turned up on its end. This face that's on the board here would normally be the front of the tractor, and you can see where the frame rails fit in each side and run back this way. So we have a pivot shaft that runs through this hole, and there's a couple taper bearings, one on each side. And then down in this hole, let me light it up for you. This is where the piston goes that moves back and forth and turns the shaft that goes in this hole. Here's the bottom of it. That's the place for another taper bearing or bearing cone to go. And here are all the parts that came out of it. This sleeve goes in the bore for the piston. Here's the piston itself. It's a two-way. Pressure on either side moves this rack back and forth and rotates on this pinion shaft. And then this face controls which way the wheels go. We got some covers and new O-rings and seals. This is a funky 3-lip seal to go into it. First step in assembly is actually the part that I was having the most problems with, and the reason I tore it apart is the bottom of this pivot shaft is leaking, and there's two seals. One of them is this 3-lip seal, and it's pretty easy to understand which way to install because this side says dirt. So this side goes down. Just tap it into place with a blunt chisel. There's an O-ring above this that was probably the real culprit. I think this is more to sweep dirt away, keep it from getting to the O-ring. This is a Case IH part made by National Seal. Next, this big tapered bearing. I'm reusing what was in here because the bearings looked fine. Next, we have 3 giant O-rings that go down into the bore before the sleeve for the piston can be put in. Down in there, you can see 2 grooves, intermediate, and then there's one spot for an O-ring here at the very top. Lube up the O-rings. There's one. And there's the second one. This is the sleeve that goes in the bore with the O-rings, and you can see the dark spots on the sleeve of where the O-rings rode. And what the O-rings do is they separate high pressure oil from low pressure oil. So you have just plain lubricating oil here where the pivot shaft goes through, but where the hydraulic piston is, you've got the heads of the piston on either side, and that's high pressure oil in here. So the O-rings keep leak back from happening, high pressure to low pressure. Lube up this bore with some High-Tran and lube up the sleeve. And my last big O-ring goes all the way up the sleeve. At this end of the sleeve, you have a blind hole in the oil port to pressurize oil feeding in this side of the piston. And on this end, you have the oil feed hole right here, sealed by this O-ring to feed this end of the piston. I'm going to have to tap this past the second O-ring because it's awful tight. Now this sleeve is eccentric. In other words, the wall of the sleeve is thinner on one side than the other. So if you rotate this, you can change the relationship of the rack that's on the piston to that pinion gear that runs through. And I marked on here, because my steering's fine, it's not loose, where this tang went so that I can rotate it back and get the same sort of relationship between the rack and the pinion. So I'll just tap this around until it lines up with my marks. Here's the piston that goes in. Notice the rack here. And I looked, I don't see any wear at all on these teeth, not like the old letter series ones that you would always have to turn the gear or replace the screw shaft on them. This has got seals at either end of it because you've got pressure pushing on either end, and these are two-piece. Underneath this, I guess this looks like a Teflon seal to me. There's an O-ring under here. Now I'm opting not to replace these because when I looked at them through the dealer, they were more than $50 a piece, and the steering worked fine. It just leaked, so I'm installing as is for better or worse. Oh, and a couple other things. See that mark right there? That's the center mark on that tooth. We're going to need that later. The front end of the piston has 2 scores on it, and the rear end has 1. So it goes in like this. Lube everything up. There we go. Actually, this is stamped rear as well, so that makes it real clear. Next, I'm going to temporarily put this cover on to keep the piston from falling out. And then turn this on its side. And this is probably the seal that was really the cause of the leak. This lower O-ring that goes in. This surprises me a bit. So this direction is down, bottom of tractor. Here's the O-ring. This cavity winds up getting filled with oil when the tractor's running with a rack and pinion in it. But no oil gets down here if this O-ring does its job. We just have a dust seal down here, and we've got the taper bearing in here. But there is a hole here in front with the remains of something in it that passes through here to where you would lubricate the bearing. The owner's manual is not real clear, but it does say there's an upper bolster grease zerk on Farmall tractors. So I think I'll put one in. I suspect there was one of those barbed push-in fittings, grease fittings in here, but I'm going to put in a 1/8 inch pipe thread fitting because they're much easier to replace if they ever get clogged up. There, completes that little sidetrack. I greased the bearing on the pinion shaft in this, not knowing that it needed to be greased in advance. I did the best I could. We could shoot some in after it's assembled. A couple things about this pinion. I looked for wear on it just like the rack, and there's no wear on it. I think riding in oil helps a lot. And there are 2 dots on 2 of the pinion teeth, right here and here, and this is what you use to line up or center it on the rack. Those 2 dots there and there have to go on either side of that mark I noted on the rack. So we got to turn things a little bit here. Get them in the right spot. I'll take the covers off that I put on temporarily so I can push on the piston. Yep. I'm going to have to temporarily remove this grease zerk I put in so that air can escape the cavity. The grease is sealing it all up. There we go. This is the top bearing. I put a little lubricate 105 on it. It'll ride in oil, but until startup, this will keep it. Then this nut goes on. The service manual says to tighten this to a slight preload. There's no numbers given. I guess we'll just go by feel. That was more than a slight preload. Let's back it off a little bit. That's good. There's a key on the shaft so that you can lock the nut to it. Don't take much. That's what this little sleeve on the nut is for. Zerk back in. I turn it over to put the covers on, but before I put the covers on, I want to explain how this works. Super simple. So this piston that's down in here is diagonal like that, and of course the rack on the piston turns the pinion shaft here, rotating this plate over here. Now, the way that the piston is pushed is there's a port here at this end of the piston, and there's a port here that takes care of the inside end of the piston. And when you turn the steering wheel, it's both providing fluid under pressure to push and to pull on both ends of this piston, one way or the other, depending which way the steering wheel turns. That's all there is to it. O-ring for the top cover. O-ring makes the seal. There's no gasket. Cover over the piston. O-ring. This groove here matches the location of this port in the side where it comes through the sleeve. This says top. This port on the top of the unit was a mystery to me when I pulled the tractor apart. I know that this port and this port are what steer left and right. All this does, I think, is lubricate the pinion gear in the rack, that void space in there between the two O-rings that are in that sleeve. And the lubrication comes after it goes through the oil cooler in the front of the engine. It comes into here, but it's a one-way journey. There's no outlet. So I think what happens is it just fills that space and keeps it filled, and that's about it. That's the difference between low pressure oil and high pressure oil I was talking about earlier in the video. That, of course, the steering PSI is someplace in the neighborhood of 3,000, and then the lubrication PSI that you get running through the oil cooler is much, much lower than that. So you've got high pressure and low pressure oil both in the unit. Steering arm goes right here, and of course this is connected to the tie rods for the front wheels, and it just rotates back and forth like this. But I'm not putting it on now. I'm going to paint things and then I'll assemble it. I hung this on the hoist, which is out of the frame that way. It's ready for final clean and painting with the next batch of parts. I guess as I think about this third port more, it seems like a kind of a safety relief to me. So if either end of this cylinder is leaking, the seals are leaking on it, and it's coming back into the center area, it gives a place in oil to escape to the lower pressure lubrication system on the tractor, lubrication and cooling system, rather than leaking out one of the seals. So it probably serves multiple functions. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful to somebody down the road, and I'll see you next time.